I'd like to welcome Professor Coffey, who holds a BS in Psychology from the College of William and Mary, a BS in System Sciences, an MS in Computer Science Software Engineering, and an educational doctorate with an emphasis on computer science from the University of West Florida. He was one of the first members of the Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, and he has worked with that organization for many years. He has been in a Department of Computer Science at the University of West Florida since 1992, starting as a lecturer and working his way up to his current rank of professor. He has published a total of more than 100 refereed journal articles, book chapters, technical reports, and conference proceedings. His research interests include knowledge elicitation and representation, web services and service-oriented architecture, advanced technology for education, and computer science education. The title of his talk is Difficulties in Determining Data Breach Impacts. Thank you very much, Dr. Coffey.
And thank you. The overview for my talk today is I'd first like to talk about cybersecurity forensics as a fundamentally wicked problem. I would like to give you a broad overview of the picture of data breaches generally speaking, and just how intertwined and interconnected the multi-facets of these are. I'd like to talk about the state of data breach reporting in the United States, and I would compare it and contrast a little bit to the state in the European Union. I'd like to try to give you some indication of the costs insofar as we can know them, both to the firm and to the individual, of data breaches, but I would like to convince you that in fact those costs are far from certain. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the emerging field of anti-forensics, which pushes back against our ability to be able to tell just what are the impacts of a data breach. And then I would like, by the end of the talk, to have convinced you that in fact your data isn't secure and never will be, and there are a variety of precautions that you as an individual can and certainly should take to protect yourself. So, what are wicked problems? I'm curious, how many of you have heard of the concept of wicked problems? It comes from the field of design, is where it originated in a seminal paper from 1995. Wicked problems are those that are inherently complex and multifaceted. The basic nature of the problem changes over time. The problems are never resolved definitively, and individual instances of wicked problems simply don't have a good stopping rule. We don't know when we're done trying to solve. Another characteristic of wicked problems is that different parties to the problem tend to have different and potentially competing incentives and different goals for how the problem might ultimately be resolved. This graphic's kind of hard to see from back there, but it does give sort of an overview of the situation with regard to data breaches. This top row illustrates various types of data that can be breached, including personally identifiable information, financial records, health records, payment card data, credentials that people might hold, educational attainment and education records, of course, protected by FERPA in the United States, catch-all for other types of data, and etc. The second row illustrates the various modalities for data breaches, including external entities hacking, payment card fraud, unintended disclosure by people who don't have any malicious intent, but somehow or another manage to cause data to be disclosed. Insider attacks, malicious insiders, are a significant problem for all organizations. And then the idea of loss or theft through some means, unknown causes where there has been data disclosed, but they don't know who did it or how it was done. So this overall picture in itself is complex, but then understand that there are interactions among these various actors that can cause data breaches to occur. So for instance, it is often the case that an external hacking entity is facilitated by insiders who help them to know information that can help them to get into systems. Data breach reporting in the United States is messy. It is only as of 2018 that Alabama and South Dakota became the last states finally to require data breach reporting at all. So laws are based on the state level. They are complex and full of legalese. It is actually difficult for an organization to know whether or not it is fully in compliance with data breaching reporting because of the fact that it is so complex and written by lawyers. By contrast, the General Data Protection Regulation, and I suspect we have some Europeans here who may have their own separate opinions about this, but the GDPR went into effect in 2018, and it is strongly geared toward reporting to help consumers to know when things have gone wrong and they might have a situation that they have to deal with. The regulation requires mandatory reporting within 72 hours of a breach. That's kind of an interesting topic in itself because 72 hours out from a detected data breach, a company has, or an organization of any sort, has very little real understanding of what has happened. We will see later on that it takes much, much longer than that really to understand the scope of the breach, even to be sure that the attack has been terminated. But it is interesting to note that the first 2 months of the GDPR being in effect, there were over almost 1,200 reports, whereas in the same 2 months the prior year there were some 400 reports. So GDPR has almost tripled the amount of reporting of data breaches. And of course, one of the themes of this talk is the public simply doesn't know what is going on with regard to their sensitive data being breached, and the reasons for that are manifold. The Privacy Rights Clearinghouse is a very interesting organization. They were early on in identifying the concept of identity theft. They were instrumental in getting data breach notice law implemented so that there are, in fact, reports on data breaches. And interestingly, and close to home for me, the Privacy Rights Clearinghouse played quite a role in getting security freeze laws, which means that an individual in the United States who has had breached data can ask the 3 major credit reporting agencies not to disclose their credit reports. This is a very powerful self-protection because in the absence of this disclosure, people who have fraudulently obtained personally identifiable information cannot take out credit cards. Because if you try to get a credit card, they go to the credit bureaus to see what your credit is as part of determining the interest rate. And in the absence of the ability to get a report, no credit card. PRC, by the way, is one of the most comprehensive databases on data breaches. They have reported over 11 billion records being breached in 9,000 separate instances since 2005. However, their data is a complete mess when it comes right down to it. There are a great many number of cases in which the number of breached records is either estimated or unknown. With regard to medical records in particular, I did an analysis of the database, and it turns out that a large majority of the medical record breaches, they don't really know how the breach occurred. They were in the category of unknown in terms of how the data got out there. Oftentimes, there are a few details regarding the amount of unique sensitive information that was disclosed. Sometimes the narratives which accompany each of the accounts will just simply cite ranges. We think somewhere between 10 and 40,000 records were breached. So we get these nice tidy graphics that look like this. This one summarizes the number of breaches that occurred on the left register, and on the right scale is the number of records exposed. And interestingly, you will note that this particular claim was that some 179 million records were breached in 2017. Here's 2018's top 10 data breaches. Marriott International, we're in Hilton, thank heaven, this is good. Marriott International, 500 million users were breached. Twitter, 330 million. You can read the list. If you tally these up, the top 10 only in 2018 was a breach of over 1.3 billion records. It's pretty hard for me to believe that that constituted an increase of 7 times over the cited figure for 2017. My guess would be that one of these is pretty, or very likely both, are pretty seriously off. I want to talk a little bit about the costs of a data breach to the firm, and then in just a few moments to the individual. IBM and Ponemon release a cost of data breach study each year. Their 2018 breach was based on 477 organizations, and they try to identify how many customer records were stolen or lost, what percentage of the customer base was lost as a result of the breach. There are huge impacts on trust for organizations when their data is breached, and this gives organizations powerful disincentive to report information. And in the presence of varying reporting requirements that are hard to interpret anyway, firms disproportionately tend to say, we're not going to say anything we don't have. It's like an IRS audit, right? The typical thing for an IRS audit in the United States is don't offer anything that you don't have to. And that's the fundamental state of reporting for firms. So some of the findings of their report was that the average data breach cost $3.8 million in 2018, an increase of 6% year over year. The likelihood of being breached again was very high for a company that was breached. These two right here, mean time to identify and mean time to contain, are very, very interesting numbers. The mean time to identify means the breach has been ongoing, and you will see IBM assessed that 197 days, or more than half a year, was the average time it took a company to figure out they'd been breached. From the time they knew that they had been, the mean time to contain, so the clock starts running after they know they've been breached, at what point do they have a reasonable expectation that they have contained the breach? Because, of course, it's really hard to know that they have ferreted out all of the malware that might have been installed in a data breach. Interestingly, the report is strictly descriptive statistics, typically giving mean values, average values for things, with very little bit about variability about the mean. So fundamentally descriptive rather than quantitative comparisons, and nothing on variability. This is an abridged version of the self-cited limitations on the study. It is a non-statistical sample. They are concerned about non-response. They had a very small sample in terms of the global cohort of companies that we have. I was very struck by what they characterized as sampling frame bias. The authors suggest that the current sampling frame is biased toward companies with more mature privacy or information security programs. Why that? Because IBM and Ponemon were dealing with companies with which there were security arrangements. So these companies obviously had fairly secure, fairly mature security apparatus in place in the first place. So their report doesn't really speak to the relatively more vulnerable companies with whom they didn't have a formal relationship. What about costs to the individual? The Consumer Sentinel Network, I never knew about this. It's probably something that everybody should know about because the Consumer Sentinel Network, maintained by the United States Federal Trade Commission, is responsible for tracking fraud and problems with identity theft and things like this in the United States. Unfortunately, the way that the Consumer Sentinel Network gets its data is it all originates via consumer complaints. So if a consumer doesn't complain, Consumer Sentinel Network never hears about it. And in fact, that is a theme that undergirds all of this. there is extraordinary levels of underreporting, both by the firm and by the individual. And this is another thing that keeps us from really knowing the full impacts of data breaches. With regard to identity theft, in 2017, 16 million victims reported that they had trouble with identity theft. That was 6.6% of consumers, or 1 in 15 people, had identity theft issues. So it's a very, very common problem to occur. Here's a typical case. I only bring this one up because I'm sort of a computer dweeb and these sorts of things interest me, but this friend finder website was hacked, and hackers were able to get 20 years of data out of 6 databases in an attack. It turned out that they were using an SHA-1 hashing algorithm for the passwords. This is a very well-known weak system for protecting passwords. And yet here we are in 2016 with this very, very mediocre protection. And by the way, I also noted this is October 2016. They reported 412 million accounts breached. And if we go back to our old friend here, they said in 2016 they were reporting 36 million records breached. The Equifax breach. Kind of curious, how many of you have heard of the Equifax breach in the United States? This was a real biggie. We have 3 major credit reporting agencies in the United States, of which Equifax is one. And this agency has data on virtually every American. They have 800 million people in their database, by the way, so however many of those are from the United States, they also have significant numbers of people, credit reports for significant number of people internationally. There was a vulnerability in their application that exposed the sensitive data, including names, addresses, social security numbers, in many cases credit cards, for 143 million Americans. It was discovered in the end of July 17, estimated to have started in mid-May, but again, estimated is the key word because all of these forensics exercises are probabilistic rather than deterministic. In October, they raised the number to 145. In March 18 to almost 148 million. So 5 million, give or take, just in a few months that they didn't really even know about. Anti-forensics are very interesting and an emerging field. And I'm quickly running out of time, so I'll try to get through this very quickly. There are fundamental approaches by which intruders can disguise what they have done. They can do data hiding, they can wipe out artifacts, they can obfuscate the trail, they can take attacks against both the forensic process and tools that forensics analysts use. Some examples, data hiding. You can go out today and download a little program called Slacker, which will enable you to take files and write into the slack space on hard disks. Because of alignment on computer hard disks, there are always slack space in individual sectors on the hard disk, and you can obfuscate a file by removing it from where it was, writing it into slack space. There is data falsification, MACE attacks. MACE refers to modified, accessed, created entry for each file in your file system. These various descriptors are there. And there is a program, again, that you can just download whenever you want and run it, called Timestamp, which will enable you to put whatever accessed modified dates you want on files, and this completely negates the ability of forensics experts to tell when files were accessed and what was done with them. Worse still are insiders. If they can run local programs on a computer And a malicious insider can run a program locally from a jump drive that might be bootable, for instance. Then there are just no trace left at all of what went on with regard to the attack. And finally, it's worth noting that forensic specialists tend to utilize similar computer software tools, and they have similar workflows. The workflow really involves fundamentally creating as detailed as possible a timeline of what occurred in the breach, and things like timestamp completely run roughshod over their ability to do that. So the overall picture is a data breach event occurs. It is expensive to look into it for the company. There is always going to be a time delay before any real understanding of the nature of the breach is known. There is significant uncertainty in the process, and all of this takes place against the backdrop of anti-forensics making it that much more difficult to determine these things. We get to a report. There is in the United States a lack of universal reporting requirements. The requirements themselves are bound up in legalese, and there are right from the beginning substantial disincentives to disclose anyway. And all of this leads to diminished public awareness and difficulty in knowing what are the impacts of a data breach. What can individuals do? Every single one of us should be doing every single one of these things. Yes, in what universe will that take place? Certainly using unique passwords, unique, strong passwords. Password managers are worth their weight in gold. You probably have a login, for instance, on our learning management system back at the University of West Florida. I bring up the front page for it, and a little built-in password manager is the one that populates with my user ID and password. You can buy third-party programs that will do that for all the applications on your computer, and they are very, very worthwhile to help you. There is a strong move toward two-factor authentication, and on truly critical accounts, two-factor authentication really needs to be the norm. It is impossible to overestimate how critical it is that you are suspicious of emails. 7 in 10 cyber attacks start with a successful phishing email. So phishing email is somebody pretending to be someone you know who tries to get your trust and then cause you to do things that are going to compromise your data. Routinely, emails that ask you to click through to another website. They are just absolutely notorious for, you go to the website and the website downloads malware to your machine, and then you're in the game. It is critical always to update software whenever new updates come out, because a large percentage of software updates are, in fact, vulnerability fixes. There's the whole idea of zero-day vulnerabilities, which is always scary. This is the best cybersecurity experts don't know all of the various vulnerabilities in systems, and so we're always uncovering new ones, and that is why we get so many software updates. Credit freezes, as I mentioned earlier, are important in my life after the Equifax breach, and they make it a lot harder for identity thieves to be able to use your credentials. On the other hand, I'm going to be 70 in a couple of days. I just signed up for Social Security, and I couldn't do an online Social Security registration because Social Security checks my credit. I would have had to unfreeze my credit for Social Security to have a look, so it cost me a visit to the office. You certainly should limit personal information you give out. And particularly there are tracker blockers such as Disconnect and Privacy Badger that protect against malware and ransomware being delivered into your computer. So certainly data breach detection is worth, talking about it is worthy of a conference on complexity in informatics. Data breach detection and amelioration, it definitely falls into the category of wicked problems. There are a variety of factors that work against the goal of clear understanding for the impacts of data breaches. Firms have very strong disincentives not to disclose any more than necessary. Anti-forensics measures make understanding the nature of a data breach that much more difficult. Impacts for consumers are often delayed, but individual measures that we can take can help to save the day. Thank you very much.